Volcanoes. They're scary. They're unpredictable and capable of wiping out entire civilizations. Luckily for us, though, they're also pretty rare, which is why we tend to forget that living near one is kind of like playing a game of volcanic chicken with Mother Nature. You don't have to live in Pompeii to be affected by volcanoes either. There are active volcanoes all over the world, from Mount Vesuvius, the volcano that destroyed Pompeii, to Mount Fuji in Japan, to Mount St. Helens in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. And while we've gotten a lot better at predicting when a volcano will erupt, that doesn't mean we could stop it or even know how badly it will affect people in the surrounding area until it happens. But what if you were in Pompeii? What would the final hours of your life look like if you were hanging out around the most famous volcano of all time when it blew its lid? The last thing you would see, smell, and taste. Pompeii was a city just minding its own business. In 79 AD, when Mount Vesuvius started acting up. But this wasn't going to be any ordinary eruption. Oh no, this was going to be the mother of all eruptions, a volcanic apocalypse. But you didn't know that, and neither did anyone else. So you went about your day like normal. In fact, you might have been headed into town because the Roman Forum had decided to hold gladiator games in the city square that day. And you weren't gonna miss that. As you walk through the streets, you might have seen some other interesting sights, like the Stabian baths, which were popular with the wealthy, or the Forum baths, which were more modest but just as popular with everyone else. It would have been hard to avoid the bustle of daily life in the center of Pompeii. In fact, there wouldn't have been much time to avoid anything that day, since things would start moving very fast. As you made your way through the streets, you may have noticed something odd. Some of the walls had small cracks in them, and there was ash falling from the sky, but you probably just assumed that it was the result of an earthquake, which happened fairly regularly in the region. You may have even thought that the reason the local priests had been making a big show of holding religious ceremonies to appease the gods. After all, earthquakes could be deadly, and they were also kind of inconvenient because you just couldn't get your fish to school on time every day. You didn't know that those priests had been doing those rituals because they had recently consulted the entrails of sacrificial animals and found disturbing omens. That, along with some recent tremblings and the fact that the lake on the other side of the volcano had mysteriously dried up, had led them to believe that something was up with Vesuvius. But their warnings were ignored because, well, it's not like Vesuvius had ever erupted before, right? If it had, nobody would have settled such a nice place, right next to a volcano. So you head to the Forum to watch the gladiator games. Maybe you have a few drinks and bet on your favorite. You try to ignore the small tremors you feel. Maybe you can even hear the rumble of the earth. But you put all of that down to the exciting spectacle that awaits you in the arena. You watch as two gladiators do battle until one of them falls, and the crowd cheers. When it's time to go, you make your way home, where you live with your mom and dad, maybe a brother or sister too. Your house isn't fancy, but it's got a courtyard and a little garden. It's pretty cozy. And even though you're a little tired, it's not late, and you have to get up early to take care of your business in the morning. So you sit down for dinner and chat with your family about your day. You still notice things aren't quite right, like how dark it is outside, even though it should be light in the evening in early September. And there's still that ash falling from the sky, along with small pebbles and pumice stones. You step outside to take a closer look and realize that the sky is filled with ash. The air is thick and heavy and smells strongly of sulfur. You can hear rocks and dirt falling from the sky and crashing to the ground. You can see Mount Vesuvius in the distance and realize that there's a giant cloud of ash coming from its peak. You know in your gut that you need to get out of there. Unfortunately, you have no idea how bad things are going to get or how far away you need to get away. And you certainly don't know that you're looking at a pyroclastic surge, a superheated cloud of gas and ash that would incinerate everything in its path. This particular one reached speeds of up to 100 miles per hour and temperatures of 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, which is hotter than the surface of the sun. You may have tried to run away, but there was nowhere to go. The pyroclastic surge was so hot that it killed people instantly by burning their flesh and even vaporizing their body fat. Others were suffocated by the huge cloud of ash that followed the surge. Even if you had managed to survive the initial blast somehow, you wouldn't for long. A total of 40 cubic miles of material was ejected from Vesuvius that day, including pumice, ash, and rock. Huge avalanches of debris raced down the slopes of the volcano, eventually reaching the city of Pompeii. People who were able to flee the initial blast found themselves buried under tons of pumice and ash. Those who didn't were burned alive in their homes or out in the street. Pompeii was completely buried under a thick layer of ash and pumice. The pyroclastic surge hit the city so hard that it leveled entire city blocks, knocking buildings off their foundations and flinging them down the volcano slopes. But that wasn't the end. Oh no, Vesuvius wasn't finished with you yet. If you were still alive at this point, you might have managed to dig yourself out of the debris, only to find yourself in a world covered in ash. It would have been hard to breathe in the ash-filled air, but you might have managed if you hadn't been overcome with coughing fits brought on by the fine ash particles that had irritated your lungs. If you had wandered out of your neighborhood, you would have found entire households buried in the street, including people, animals, and even food. It would have looked like someone had pressed pause on a particularly gruesome episode of Friends. You might have wondered what the heck had happened to Pompeii. Where were the people? Where were their houses? It would have been hard to recognize the city you had lived your whole life in. And then the ash would have started raining down again. Mount Vesuvius continued to erupt intermittently for days, causing more ash and pumice to rain down on Pompeii and the surrounding area. Eventually, it would have been impossible to continue digging out survivors. Everyone was dead. Entire families were wiped out. Slaves, merchants, priests, gladiators, all of them were dead. You may have stayed in your house trying to wait it out, but you would have eventually succumbed to the toxic gases or suffocated from the ash covering your mouth and nose. Or you may have decided to flee the city entirely. But wherever you went, you would have been met by the same thing, ash. The ash would have covered the surrounding countryside, killing plants and animals alike. You may have tried to run away from the ash, only to collapse from exhaustion or simply die of fright. Nothing could have prepared you for what happened at Pompeii. More than 2,000 years later, archaeologists are still discovering new things about what happened to the people who lived there. Thanks to the combination of heat, ash, and lack of oxygen, bodies were perfectly preserved in the rubble, allowing researchers to learn more about what killed them and how quickly it happened. Many died standing up, suggesting they were caught in the middle of the chaos. Others were found hugging their children, shielding them with their bodies. You may have been one of the lucky ones who died instantly, but however you died alone, cut off from your friends and family. You died without knowing what hit you. You died not knowing that Mount Vesuvius would become the deadliest volcano in history. Now check out. This is what would happen if Yellowstone exploded. Or watch. Do you remember Lady Gaga's meat dress? Here's what really happened to it.